All right, so let's start. More people will probably join us when we start, so let's get on to it. So good evening to everybody who has already joined us. Welcome to our next Liberty webinar. This event is organized jointly by Students for Liberty Czech Republic and Slovak Students for Liberty. If you don't know us, we are a student organization devoted to promoting individual liberty and freedom and organizing events like this. And if you like our events and if you want to support us, you can definitely do so. We will appreciate that. And you can do so by following the directions in the event description, both on Facebook and on YouTube, where we are also streaming. And our guest today is Bill Wirtz, a journalist and senior policy analyst at Consumer Choice Center. And we are going to talk about how the current coronavirus crisis impacts government, the power of governments, and what the future development will probably be. So on to Bill. I've recently read somebody said that the crisis shows that the governments view citizens' rights as permissions. So is this the case, Bill?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jan, for allowing me to talk tonight. And so do we do this as a Q&A, or do I do a presentation, then we go to Q&A from the people?
I think you can start with some talk and then we can continue with Q&A.
Sure, sounds good, because what you described is very correct. I'd just give a few things, just very briefly about me. So my name is Bill Wirtz, and I'm a columnist, journalist, and also a senior policy analyst at a consumer group called the Consumer Choice Center. And my work focuses a lot on European Union policy and politics. But this topic, I think, is very important to me as a libertarian, but I think it should be important to anyone. I have communicated a lot about this topic, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and there's a lot of problems with this lockdown policy. So what I will be trying to do is look at three specific questions. So when we inquire about the lockdown in itself, we need to ask, what is the lockdown? What does the lockdown, and what will the lockdown do in the future? So what the lockdown is a question of definition. I mean, I could also label it, and it would be similarly correct, that this is a forced quarantine. You could even equate it with imprisonment of the entire population, with notable exceptions. And the question about, when you ask yourself about what is the law, it is all about the question of enforcement. Carl Llewellyn wrote in his book on our law and its study that where there is no sanction, there is no law. So as an example, if the speed limit is 50 kilometers per hour and the police only starts enforcing it from 70 kilometers per hour, then the effective speed limit is 70 kilometers per hour. Right? If nobody's giving you a fine, then there is no law. So the law ultimately comes down to what the law enforcement officer does to you in that specific moment. That is what the law is. Another example is, for instance, in my home country, Luxembourg, it is mandatory to vote. The last person to having been punished for not voting was in the 1960s. So effectively, it is not illegal to abstain from voting, even though most people, when they look at the law, they will say, well, look, it says is illegal now. So the lockdown is effectively how it is enforced. And this is very important when I come to later in my presentation about the question of these quote-unquote abuse of power, is where policemen go too far. And we go by too far, respectively, to what the law is supposed to be. But since especially these lockdown measures are so incredibly vague, the enforcement is effectively the law. And I think that is important to know. But more important, of course, is what does the lockdown do? In effect, it suspends a lot of our freedoms. It suspends our freedom of movement. It suspends certain contracts. I will get to that. It suspends, to an extent, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And what does that mean in practice? So what have we seen come out of this lockdown so far? We've seen people harassed by law enforcement. This happens in the Czech Republic. It happens all around Europe. It happens more specifically in countries that were more prone towards authoritarianism in the first place. If you today Google man or woman arrested for walking, all your search results will be about coronavirus. And just up until a few months ago, that would have seemed ridiculous to us. So all of these suspensions came very quickly. The police arrest people for playing catch with their children. They arrest people for going for a second walk. The police even surveys people with drones and boasts about it. In the UK, this has been specifically the case, where they sent out drones on people who went for a walk in a park, very remote, no contact with other people. And then the police followed them with the drone and said, this is not an essential walk. In some cases, it is the fact that public officials, mayors in Italy, humiliate their own citizens for going outside and yell at them and expose them publicly. You see a number of pictures online of people doing the same. We also see protests being broken up. Protesting is the one way in which we express dissent, in which we criticize the measures of the government. The right to protest is so absolute it should never be questioned. And yet, in most countries right now, it is not legal to protest. You will have seen that in Germany, the Constitutional Court has now overturned restrictions on protests. So now people can legally protest in Germany. We also see restrictions on free movement. Now, free movement being restricted between countries. So this is where you're trying to cross a border. But even those have exemptions. For instance, if you're a commuter between many states, you can indeed enter the country with certain permits. Now, that doesn't quite fly with the reality of a virus, but that may be so. You also have restrictions on movement within countries, where you are asked where you go, and you are only allowed to travel if you are an essential worker. Now, the restrictions on borders has created enormous supply chain problems, because especially at the beginning, the lorries or the trucks that were trying to cross the border in order to go to retail shops, they were not getting through because of pileups. And so the initial problems in our retail stores of goods not being delivered, that was a problem entirely created by our restrictions on border traffic. Now, this is not particularly problematic. I mean, a lot of people had stocks of toilet paper, but this is very problematic if that lorry or delivery is bringing essential medicine. Because lest we forget, we don't only have coronavirus patients right now, we have a lot of people with illnesses that need care. And that's something also that I will go into a bit later. We have effectively suspended many of the privacy rules that we have. You might remember about 2 years ago, the European Union came up with a GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. That is when all of you received emails from companies whose newsletters you were maybe subscribed to in the past, and they said, do you want to resubscribe? Because the European Union established that to a certain degree, and that's within interpretation of the law that we don't exactly have certainty of, but they established that holding a list, a database of just your email address and your name was so problematic that we needed to establish clear consent on whether you want that newsletter and that data to be stored or not. Now we have effectively suspended GDPR because now we are tracking and tracing our own citizens. In your neighbor country, Poland, the coronavirus app that people have to install if they have coronavirus or are believed to have coronavirus requires them to take a selfie of themselves whenever the app asks them to do so. Now, the European Union is also talking about a EU coronavirus app, but that could only work if the strictest common denominator was applied. I mean, if Brussels went and said, well, now we're going to have an EU one that's going to respect our rules, then Poland is never going to accept an app that doesn't have its own strict features in it. That's the reason they activated it in the first place. So the only way by which we couldn't have an EU response on the tracking and tracing response is if all the countries had the strictest possible measures. The European Union is also asking your telecoms providers to give them information on your movement. Now, to a certain extent, the European Union says that this data is anonymized. But we also know from studies, and I will be posting a bit later some of my own columns on this issue, that anonymized data can be re-identified fairly easily, which is why companies like Uber and Apple have gone a step beyond that and go to further steps of anonymization that are more secure. But you better believe that the government will not be very good at doing that. We also see that they're asking now Google and Facebook to track movement. At the beginning, this was supposed to see whether the lockdown measures are being respected, but more and more this becomes about individual movement. In Austria, the government was considering, at least the chairman of parliament was considering, to make the coronavirus app instituted by the Red Cross, the voluntary app, mandatory, meaning that if you don't have the app on your phone, you're not allowed to leave your house until a vaccine is developed or something, or at least by the time that coronavirus is not considered a threat anymore, which we don't know when that is going to be. I also see that some people who, like me, are very, very critical of the lockdown, give the example of South Korea as a counterexample of lockdowns are not entirely necessary, but I would tread with caution for the exact reason of privacy. Now, South Korea has done a very good job at testing people, but you could also say it has done a very good job of instituting George Orwell's 1984. I mean, Big Brother is very real. The Guardian actually had a very good article on the perverse effects of its very intense tracking and tracing in South Korea. One example that they gave was that a man was having dinner or lunch or something at a restaurant that is very close to the area in which people go to see prostitutes. He was later diagnosed with coronavirus, and then it was publicly said that he got it from a prostitute, which was later discovered to be untrue, and the agency apologized and said, well, that was a mistake. Actually, our tracking was not as precise as we believed it to be. But just imagine the humiliation of a person who's named in public, having gone to prostitutes. His family believes that. Maybe his spouse believes that. You can ruin people's lives. And as we all know, the negative news is usually what we keep in our minds. The rectification of something actually not being as bad or positive coming in is usually not the information we are most interested in. As somebody who works in broadcast journalism, I can tell you that those are the negative stories are obviously the ones that sell. I think we all know the expression, the news, millions of planes landed safely today, is not one that really sells particularly well in a newspaper. We also see that family members in numerous countries, now I've been told that this is not the case in the Czech Republic, but that family members in numerous countries are not allowed to visit their dying relatives. So they're not allowed to see their own family members in their last moments, which is, I mean, taking a step back and seeing how incredibly problematic that is, how incredibly devastating that must be for a family to not being able to see their dying relatives, especially now that we know that in some countries it is possible to do that safely. Another result has been that they have effectively disabled certain contracts. Now, one specific example is being airlines. So if an airline canceled your ticket, which has now been the case for me for 3 different tickets, I travel quite a bit, is that now in certain countries, airlines are arguing, and on an EU level as well, that they should not be giving people refunds for those tickets. Now, in a free market, of course, your cancellation policy should be determined by what you click on when you buy your ticket. That would be the ideal scenario. However, there is some government-mandated insurance called Directive EU 261, which mandates insurance for the airline. So they need to refund you if they cancel. But we also know that airlines add that added price for that government-mandated insurance on your ticket price anyway. So by one way or another, you have paid for insurance by paying more for your ticket than you otherwise would. And these airlines will now be possibly allowed to not even give you a refund for a service you did not use in the slightest. that is also problematic. The same goes, of course, for work contracts, where government has decided that certain people don't need to show up for work. Now, for certain big companies, this might not be a direct problem, but for small companies, this is devastating, which also brings us to another result, which is that on the economy. We are now we're going into a recession that is, well, at least from a libertarian perspective, it's the most clearly government-induced recession that we've had. I mean, with all the others, we keep getting into arguments. Well, this one is clear. Gene Epstein calls it the Great Suppression, which I think is a very good word to use, because we have shut down businesses, or at least we say that we've shut down the non-essential businesses. And that, again, should tell you a lot about how people think about the economy, at least those in government. Disqualification of essential and non-essential businesses completely misunderstands the way that the economy works. The economy works through trade and interdependency. Like, we all need each other to produce and to serve each other. I mean, you can go into many different examples. For instance, not too far from where I live, there is a biomass production site. Now, these function with wood pellets. They use wood pellets in order to make electricity. Now, where do they get those wood pellets? Well, these are byproducts of other industries. For instance, furniture production. So if you make wooden furnitures, you have the rest of that wood that you can make into wood pellets and then give to the biomass production site in order to produce electricity. The non-essential business is essential to the essential business. These qualifications always create problems. This is essentially the problem of central planning. And Friedrich Hayek described this problem of the pretense of knowledge. So we presume to know how to organize the economy. And in doing so, we create a lot of problems. And we create that, which is Frédéric Bastiat, economist, a French economist, explained as the seen in the unseen. A lot of the devastation that we are creating right now is unseen. On one hand, because people are directly hurt by the measures. On the other hand, because a lack of opportunity, a lack of innovation, a lack of progress that is not happening as a result of the measures that we've implemented. As an example of the direct effects, I think most of you should probably remember the last financial crisis. And the British Journal of Psychiatry says that between 2008 and 2010, there was a dramatic spike in suicides. I remember this specifically in Luxembourg. We had a lot of suicides back then as a result of the recession and personal bankruptcies. These are deaths of an economic crash. And this is whenever somebody gets to you and says, like, well, why would you say that we should reopen the economy? You are essentially valuing GDP over human lives. If you really want to present it in a utilitarian way, it's human lives versus human lives. But that already presumes this argument that we need to weigh lives against each other as sort of the economy versus the safety against coronavirus already assumes that the lockdown measures are efficient and effective, which we don't know yet. On that, we don't have enough data. Another effect of the lockdown is an effect on free speech. We now see that social media platforms are restricting certain articles. In the early stages, articles were being taken down, and Facebook now said that it doesn't allow for protests to be advertised on Facebook. Now, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and others are private companies, but the reason why they get strict on these in these specific situations is because of government intervention. Now, you may or may not know that for the last 2 years, the European Union has been telling social media companies that they ought to self-regulate on this issue. Otherwise, EU regulation will be necessary. And we are now just in front, and the European Union Parliament is currently working on the EU Digital Services Act. And the EU Digital Services Act will essentially tell social media platforms that they are liable for harmful content on their platforms. Which means that Facebook and Twitter will be a lot more wary on a lot more attentive on what the government considers harmful content. And they go from everything from hate speech, which is difficult to define, to misinformation, which, I mean, if the government of Hungary or the government of Turkey and so on is the judge on what is misinformation, then I think we've way overstepped the line. And this is problematic in countries tending towards authoritarianism, but it equally becomes just as problematic if political considerations are at stake. And we saw this in France already. And another result is that of the rule of law. I think Hungary is a particularly good example. You know this probably better than I do because you are very close to Hungary, is that in Hungary, the government rules by decree. There's no need for parliament anymore. The government can make its rules up as it goes, and it can even jail journalists if it considers their coverage being contrary to the information given by government. And we've seen in other countries such as Azerbaijan, that the opposition is being jailed, or their meetings are restricted for concerns of coronavirus. This is also true for Turkey and other countries alike. We are essentially also, we need to realize this. We are in a microcosm of countries that are relatively free. And our policies influence other countries. If free countries maintain a lockdown and crack down on individual liberties and restrict meetings and freedom of movement, then authoritarian leaders in other continents of the world will say, well, even the pretended developed countries are doing it, so why should we not do the same? And so this is the influence, the indirect influence that we have on other countries is, I believe, very important. And then we have another result, which is people dying of a lack of treatment. There was a very viral and very, very traumatic video of a woman in China who tried to get to a hospital to bring her child in because she had cancer, and she was not let through by the police. My own colleague at the Consumer Choice Center, Fred Roeder, he had an interesting thread on Twitter, which he showed some of the delays for cancer treatments in the UK. So bowel cancer screening is suspended nationally for at least 3 months. Cervical cancer screening stopped in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Some NHS hospitals issue blanket bans for cancer treatments, which leaves even the patients with developed cancers alone. And so he will also give the example of one leading expert who warns that the delays in screening and treatment could lead to 60,000 deaths. And that's just on lack of treatment for cancer and lack of detecting cancer early enough. I mean, this is something where time plays an essential role in detecting cancer and helping people as they go along. So everything being focused entirely on this one disease is hugely problematic and leaves out all the relevant factors we would have to consider. Lastly, I think one of the social effects of the lockdown is snitches. So in some countries, you have snitch lines where people can report each other. I've seen examples just very close to me where I live, where people call the police on each other just for having a barbecue with the family that they live with in their own home, where a lot of old resentment comes out. It's an ancient old question whether these government measures create more snitches or bring out the snitches that already exist. But no matter what, it's a social problem. If I go around town just on a walk with a friend and we are fairly far away from each other, but still having a walk together, we are now turning around considering whether somebody around us might not be picking up the phone and calling the police. And that social distrust is going to stay. This is not something where you say, well, this is just a temporary measure. It's going to disappear once we lift the lockdown. No, this is something that is going to stay. And I think that is going to be hugely damaging to our social fiber. Now, to the last question, what will the lockdowns do? Because I want to have some moment for questions as well, and where we discuss it probably a bit. But first, what will the lockdowns do? To me, this is, I think, one of the underestimated, even by the critics of the lockdown, one of the underestimated problems of this measure is that it will significantly reduce the bar for lockdowns in the future, right? So usually what happens if a country turns authoritarian? Throughout history, we have a couple of examples. We even have some current examples, is that there is some sort of war, there's a direct threat, there is a terrorist attack, and then the country says, national emergency, we need to suspend all your freedoms, and then you have a ruler who stays very long. This, at least this sort of system requires a visible, known threat, or at least if the government is trying to stage this threat, it needs to put some effort into it. If coronavirus becomes the norm for what we need to lock down for, and coronavirus becomes seasonal or other diseases pop up in the future, then at the slightest few amount of cases, we're going to have complete lockdowns. And as governments, authoritarian governments, have managed to play down their numbers right now, then they're also equally able to play them up whenever it is necessary for them to implement rules that they just want to use anyway. I think this is a real underestimated problem, because even some of the people who agree with me right now that the lockdown right now is a very bad idea, what they say is that we should have implemented it back in January, because then we would have solved the problem by now. Well, first of all, we don't know that. But think about what problem that creates. If we had, I mean, first of all, nobody would have agreed with that anyway. I mean, back in January, nobody would have gotten on board with shutting the our entire way of life down. But by stating that, and if we reach that consensus that locking down in January would have been a good idea, that means that at 10 cases, like let's say we get rid of coronavirus now, but it comes back in November, then at 10 cases we can shut everything down again. And that is hugely, hugely problematic, because also it makes us lazy on the stance of public policy. We make people lazy by making them believe that the government is going to be taking care of them. By using, I mean, ultimately, quarantines is something that we use back against the plague. I mean, these are medieval type measures. We are better than that. We are more ingenious than that. And private entrepreneurs and testing methods and private laboratories are much more able to cope with these problems. We are essentially expecting an organization such as the government, which has completely screwed up all of its response. It's told us that we need to use masks, then we didn't need to use masks, then using masks was complicated or dangerous even. Now I have to wear a mask when I go outside. I still don't know whether I need it or not. I haven't quite understood what the rules are on that. The same government that has issued permits of need, where it tells private companies how many hospital beds are necessary, centrally planning medical equipment, which has put protectionist measures on medical equipment, so putting additional taxes on the fact that if you import medical equipment, you need to pay additional taxes. An example from the Czech Republic, for instance, has been that the government has told the entire country that respirators can only be delivered to legal entities of the state, then later realized that legal entities of the state did not actually include hospitals, thereby delaying the delivery of essential medical goods. So this organization that got everything wrong and centrally misplanned everything, that is now the organization we are supposed to trust when it comes to our response. And individual behavior and us evaluating our own surrounding and understanding it with the reading that we do, that is supposed to be hugely problematic. I don't buy it, and I don't think neither should you. I would conclude probably with this, is that towards because I assume I was speaking to mostly libertarians, this is the most important thing that we should be addressing right now. I mean, this is our beliefs put to the test. This is more important than anything else. If you don't speak out against if you don't speak out against the lockdown now, then I'm worried about how cemented in your beliefs are. Fundamental rights, individual liberty as a foundation of our society is not only important because all of our prosperity resides in that. The fact that we are free is the reason that we have all this technology. The reason that I can even talk to you right now is because we have these freedoms and because we defend it in every crisis. But it is also essential because those exact freedoms were written for moments of crisis. We don't have rules for freedom of speech or freedom of movement or freedom of assembly for the times that we all get along. Then they wouldn't be needed because we all understand each other. No, we actually wrote these down for the moments of crisis. And then it is our individual behavior that needs to tell us how we interact. This idea that if you lift the lockdown tomorrow, that people will be running and screaming outside with no individual mind of their own, that I think is hugely misled. It doesn't actually reflect the reality. So that will be my conclusion. Didn't want to make it too long. I think I did actually speak for half an hour now. So yeah, I'm open to all types of questions and comments, and thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you for the talk. So anybody has any questions, objections, you can turn on your microphones and speak up, or you can just type them in chat. You can also type them in Czech and in the chat in Czech, and we will translate them for you if you want.
Or they can speak, I don't know.
Okay, so if nobody has any questions so far, let me play the... Oh, wait, we have a question from Nicholas. So can you conceive of a situation in which it would be 100% justifiable to impose restrictions on another for fear of one's life?
Can you conceive of a situation in which it would be 100% justifiable to impose restrictions? Well, obviously, I mean, that's... I mean, we call that prison. So we do this for things where you actually were shown to hurt another person's property or life. So we do that already. I think Jeffrey Tucker made some interesting points on the whole question of the non-aggression principle. And I'm not sure that I think this might not necessarily relate to this question, but he said, well, he was asked if the non-aggression principle, should that apply to diseases? And he said that, well, with our current knowledge, and well, which is all of the medical knowledge of humankind so far, is that it is impossible to trace whether you gave the specific disease to someone. I mean, at this point for coronavirus, we don't even know yet which is the specific way that it transmits in the most effectively. Right? It could very well be that the most effective way of in which it transmits is by touching a certain surface and then touching your face, which is why they tell you not to touch your face. Right now, we have all these measures because we don't quite know, because the government doesn't quite know all of this. There's also equal concern that with people being put together in certain areas, and for instance, going to the supermarket on a regular basis. This is sort of the hub of where we all go at the same time, especially because we don't have much else to do these days, is that this creates additional problems. So to go back to the question, is there situations in which it's 100% justifiable to impose restrictions? Yes. Now, I'm not a personal fan of punitive justice. I'm more into reparations. So I think if you cause a damage, you should repair it. But that again would also probably be restrictions on your freedom. This is where you initiate force and other guns against another human being, and I think then it would be justified.
Do we have a follow-up question from Nicholas?
Sure. I'll go into that, and then I think Tomek wanted to speak before, and then we just let him. For follow-up, in your opinion, is social distancing necessary? With no regard to how it's imposed at the moment, is there a good libertarian right wing to impose it? Well, first of all, it should be physical distancing, not social distancing. I mean, social distancing would be if we wouldn't even get on a call or something. I'm not a particular fan of this word, but yes, physical distancing. I think it's obviously reasonable. I mean, when I get the flu, I don't visit my grandparents. And I keep away from people, and I tell them, hey, sorry, I'm sick, we ought to keep away. You probably don't want to give anyone the flu. And I think this is just reasonable behavior. Would it be imposed? Well, that depends on your definition of what imposed means, but obviously companies would make their own rules. And supermarkets had rules towards how many people are allowed to be in the shop and how they ought to behave in the shop way before even government came in on that. So I think that individual companies, organizations will make their own rules. And I think that's what customers expect anyway. I mean, if you're a client somewhere, you expect your safety to be paramount. So I think, again, this idea that much would change and people would go out and just do whatever, I think that's not entirely correct. And I think a lot of what private businesses and organizations would do would actually enforce much of the physical distancing. I think there was Tomek before who wanted to speak, or I'm not sure if he's typing it now. Otherwise,
no, I can speak.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Actually, I just raised my hand when nobody was raising hands, so I thought I could just say hello. Hello. Thank you for. So I don't actually have a question. Thank you for this nice talk. I like the way you put that. For the other side, I mean, for those who say that, hey, we need to lock down and just look at people's lives. You said that it's not like people's lives versus GDP, but lives versus lives. And this is the question which is seems to be the most loud now in discussion about coronavirus. These questions, of course, change every week. So now we can use this opportunity, and I can see that this works when I talk to various people who are a bit maybe less aware of what's going on. That this situation and this very loud in public opinion question, lives versus GDP, makes regular people kind of consider the unseen. And people start thinking, okay, so what is actually the standard of measurement of some value that we make our decisions on? Because you cannot put every on your hand only the mortality rate, for example. Or what is it then? First, if you have to be utilitarian, as you said, like, is it the longevity of like the society, or maybe the quality of life in this period that somebody is alive, and how do you calculate it? Everybody could have like different measures. Of course, you don't need to do them, but for sure it makes people question two things. What is the standard of value for this situation, and to even think of such thing as okay, if not GDP, if not mortality, then what is it between? And just making this question by people, I think will make them wiser for the future and to see the unseen consequences, because it's this first time we have such situation in the world that we are very clearly considering what if, and we are in real time with live data from all around the world, can compare what different countries are doing. So I just hope we will use this crisis as a situation, as an opportunity to like take the public opinion on our side.
I think you're making a very good point, and actually some people will have an odd awakening, because I mean, even within the perspective of the way government organizes healthcare, there are already trade-offs being done. I mean, we could give even more resources to that healthcare sector and then help save more lives, but we make different choices. Like, we could increase taxation considerably and then save more people by sending everyone a doctor to screen for cancer all the time, and we would save lives. So we are making trade-offs all the time. I mean, the trade-offs are new to the healthcare system, and a lot of people would, yes, and I think you're right, a lot of people will start understanding the concept of opportunity costs, and that these are choices we make all the time. And actually, in most cases, we make them pretty rationally. I mean, we make choices all the time in our daily lives about what we prefer and how we use our resources. And in most cases, we actually do it in order to advance our own well-being or our own happiness. And I think most people do it quite rationally. It's actually when the government starts centrally planning that resource allocation becomes very, very complicated and even impossible to do, because they don't quite know what is necessary. It's individuals who know, not central planners. I would maybe there's one more question I see in the chat. There's Stefan. Let me just read that. How worried should we be about the emergency measures staying in place after the pandemic is over in Europe? I think very worried. All the crises I can remember, I mean, the earliest one probably I can barely remember is 9/11. I mean, all of these measures stayed. All the screenings in airports that we've actually time and time again been shown are incredibly ineffective at stopping terrorism. it's why we call it security theater, these are still in place. They never disappear. And we do a lot of that security theater. In a way, you could say that lockdown is merely security theater. It's giving people the impression that that they're being protected. I mean, a very interesting example is Turkey. So Turkey already had two, I think, 48-hour complete lockdowns, and now I think it's on the it's close to having another 4-day complete lockdown. I mean, these make absolutely no sense, because after these complete lockdowns, people go out again for their walks and so on. So it doesn't make any particular sense. But they do that in order to show people, well, look, we are doing something to protect you. Then another one that we had was every terrorist attack. I mean, most of them started from 2015 on, the larger wave of terrorist attack. And if you look at a country like France, after the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan attacks, France has since then constitutionalized many of the restrictions that they previously had. So I think we'll see a watering down of many of the principles that we've had. When it comes to data privacy or free movement, I think a lot of that will be reconsidered, especially because people have now seen that these treaties are apparently not worth that much. I mean, as somebody who's fairly critical of the European Union, like, data privacy was held up like, oh, look, guys, we are the most respectful of your privacy in the whole world. And Schengen, well, of course, we ought to support the European Union because free movement is paramount. This is what holds us together. Well, as soon as a crisis comes along, everything crumbles down, and there's serious concerns whether these treaties will even be still existing after that. So I think there's a serious problem with that, and I think what is going to happen is that once we get out of this, is that people are not going to be paying much attention, because I mean I am definitely looking forward to the moment where we can go out again and enjoy ourselves, and I have so many things I want to do, but I'm also very, very worried that nobody's going to be paying attention towards how do we get rid of many of the measures, and they might even become worse. I mean, we now have talks about immunity papers. Immunity papers being so as soon as we get antibody tests, we can actually figure out who's immune to coronavirus and who is not. What is going to happen is that governments are now talking about giving those papers to some people who are then allowed to travel and go outside, and not to others, which will, of course, create a huge problem of forged papers and a whole black market that creates itself to forge these papers. And we're going to have a very different mafia created out of that. I mean, this is what happens every time we have prohibition. So to answer your question, we should be very worried and very vigilant. And Rob says, "You are my hero." Well, thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. And I think there was Gil who wanted to speak.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Bill, first of all. Well, I have a few things to say. First of all, regarding your answer to Stefan, in Israel, for example, before we had the defense, we had so many terror attacks. After or since we have defense, it's much harder for terrorists to cross the border and commit suicide bombing attacks. That's why we don't have them anymore. So it's just commenting on that it might there might be measures that do help. So that's my first comment. If you have anything to say about that, I would appreciate it. Second, regarding your second answer to Nicolas, the main problem with this pandemic is the asymptomatic patients, as far as I see it. So I'm wondering what measures can be provided by the free market, in your opinion, about them.
Well, so on your first comment, well, I think with my position on the lockdown, I have already enraged so many people that commenting on Israel-Palestine now would probably be not necessary. I mean, we're just putting fuel on the fire.
It's not about just to clarify. It's not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's just to say that sometimes there are measures that are taken and they are beneficial, even because you said that protecting or securing airports does not help to prevent terror, but sometimes there are measures that are taken and they are beneficial to prevent it.
Sure. Usually the government measures are the least likely to be. I mean, if you look, at the specific airport measures, we know that those are not effective because airport security does actually studies on their own procedures. But what airlines have done is to reinforce cockpit doors in order to prevent hijackings, and that has been very effective. So of course, yes, there are measures that we can take. Every security measure makes life a bit more complicated to live with, and private companies, I think, are better suited to do that. I think there again, every specific example, we would have to go into the specifics of what are the unseen consequences of every government measure when it comes to security. I remember even that we had big debates over CCTV, and those have completely disappeared. CCTV cameras are now everywhere, and nobody questions them anymore. But there used to be a lot of concerns towards that. And I'm pretty sure that at the beginning of every measure, including those in Israel, there were people raising concerns, and we should always inquire whether those have taken place or not. Your second, what was your second point again? Sorry, I'm just
yeah, no problem. No problem. Yeah, the asymptomatic patients.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the problems obviously is that we don't have the right tests. The tests that we use right now establish whether you have coronavirus or not. It doesn't even help you to identify anything else. It just says, do you have coronavirus or not? Now, we already had the problem of multiple faulty tests as well. But this is the only thing that we can establish right now. That test doesn't tell you whether you can catch coronavirus in a second wave, or again, we don't know much with these tests. The next batch of tests that we are supposedly soon going to receive is antibody tests, so immunity tests, which is how we can figure out how many people already had coronavirus, maybe even from which moment on, because there's different theories that coronavirus actually started earlier than we thought, and maybe even in different places. So this is something that we will find out. The problem that why we have these tests so late is because the government had so many restrictions. This is at least something that I think all libertarians can definitely agree on, is that the government had way too much red tape, and private laboratories were not able to get active as quickly as they should. And this is a problem in some countries more than others. I know that Germany, for instance, has a lot of testing because private labs are able to act independently. If we cut a lot of red tape, if we would get rid of these agencies that are so strict on medical innovation, then I think the private sector would provide for all the testing kits. Then you probably, by the time that, if everybody is willing to pay for testing kits a certain amount, even if it was, it's $10, the demand on the marketplace would be so large that you could get testing kits super cheaply online and could just order a bunch of them, and then we could do the test for ourselves and then identify ourselves to like a company and say, hey, I can go into work today because I've done the immunity test. Look, and that would be sort of something that you could contractually set up with one company or a business that you want to do business with. There's a lot of private solutions. Ultimately, I don't know how those would be governed. I saw an interesting interview actually with the mayor of Las Vegas, and she was calling for the reopening of casinos, and she was on CNN, and the CNN anchor said, well, but how do you not know that this will be incredibly dangerous? And she said, well, I'm just the mayor, right? I'm not running the casino. It's for the casino to figure this out. And I think she made a good point, because the ingenuity of individuals to solve these problems is much higher. Ultimately, the question shouldn't really be towards us whether we have the perfect answer as to how to solve this problem. We clearly know that the people in charge right now don't have the answers, and actually have in many cases made it worse. So I think trusting individuals with these solutions is much better. I can have a certain amount of theories as to how it's governed, but ultimately should be up to private individuals. I think I see another question. Let me just read that, or is it? I have one more question. Okay. In the US and Israel, people are gathering in the streets to protest governmental restrictions together with long-term issues. That's definitely dangerous, and a mask of or 2-meter radius doesn't help. In your opinion, how can ordinary citizens protest or arrest governmental overreach and power grabs? Well, I mean, so there's been different models, and in the US you see that, I mean, people are very car friendly in the US, but so they were protesting in cars. That is something that you can do. And yes, there are, I mean, ultimately this idea whether a mask helps a lot or how much the distance really helps is still something we don't exactly know just yet. I think there's a lot that people can do with many of the preventive measures that we use already. I remember at the beginning, the narrative was very different. I remember still going to a bar and then being told, well, wash your hands afterwards. And that narrative changed super quickly, even though the data on what is that protective measure didn't quite follow. So I'm not exactly sure if we can take this as granted on that question of protests. Where do you see the EU going post-crisis? That's a very good question, and I don't have a crystal ball. I thought that Brexit wasn't going to happen, so I'm not necessarily the best judge or the person to bet on for this answer. But I do think it definitely puts into question much of the authority. I mean, the European Union hasn't been efficient at all. It took the European Union a month to get rid of protective tariffs on medical supplies. You might have seen that when Hungary instituted its decree that officially makes Viktor Orban the dictator, von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, reacted with a letter. And in that letter, she says that, well, you know, authoritarianism is good and we shouldn't support it, but she doesn't name Hungary, which is why, by the way, Hungary signed that letter as well. Say, well, yes, of course, we're also against authoritarianism. So you see, there's some trolling going on, and Brussels isn't being taken very seriously. And this is not only me saying that. The European Union itself actually recognized that. Von der Leyen was in front of Parliament and apologized to Italy and Spain for lack of coordination and solidarity. So ultimately, what the European Union has been very good for lately is just distributing money. And I mean, there's talks about mutualizing debt. I haven't seen yet what the European Council has come up with tonight. But I think the European Union is going to be more of that, more of some countries trying to get more money out of the more prosperous countries. But ultimately, this political alignment is going to be much in question. I mean, something like the Schengen Agreement, nobody's been really paying much attention to. And if the treaty becomes just a way to convince people into supporting the European Union, but there's no actual effect to it, then I don't think the European Union is going to have much support in the future. So I think the European Union's future is very grim after this.
All right. Anybody has any more questions or objections? Okay, we have another one for Stefan.
All right. Regarding the EU slow response, is it a valid point to make that the EU was not really set up to deal with this sort of situation in the first place? Well, it certainly pretends, though, that it is the right organization to deal with this in the first place. I mean, all the crisis response press conferences sort of make a believe that the European Union is supposed to deal with that. And for a union that further goes towards integration all the time, you'd expect that, well, I mean, if it wants to solve climate change, international terrorism, and so on, well, then this logically seems like something it should address, but it was actually very bad at doing that. So it definitely wasn't set up to do that in the first place. I mean, the European communities were said to be economic cooperation, but since the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Union has sort of become bigger and bigger and sort of picks and chooses its competencies as it goes. And it takes more of those away from the member states, so that now the member states can put more and more blame on the European Union if something goes wrong. So for instance, Italy and Spain, of course, being utterly unprepared and over-regulated in the area of medical needs, can to some degree blame the European Union. Say, well, if they had helped us more, then that wouldn't have been as bad. So it becomes a scapegoat, an easy scapegoat, but not actually a problem solver. Yeah, so that would be that'd be my answer on that. I'm not sure, Jan, how are we on time? I'm not sure if there's any more questions. If you...
Okay, so do we have any more questions? All right. So it seems we don't.
Unless somebody's really fastly typing, I'm not. But yeah.
All right. So if nobody has any more questions, then thank you for the talk. Oh, we have another one, it seems.
Sure. Okay, let us give the last try here. Do you have any sort of consideration to the fact of cultural differences between countries regarding measures that should be taken? Well, right. I just saw the next question. So cultural differences. I mean, a lot of cultural differences obviously come into play here. I mean, this has been shown when people have different religious ceremonies that they really wanted to attend. I know that people are trying to celebrate Easter, for instance, were very upset by this. I'm not religious myself, but I mean, this is something that comes up. People react differently to crises, and those obviously should be taken into account locally. I mean, you know your own surrounding at best. You know exactly what your family expects and what your community expects, and how to deal with that is individually the best system. And ultimately, the great advantage is that, I mean, you can call this sort of the plague with Wi-Fi, is that now we have information sharing. So you can actually look at different communities and how they deal with the problem and see what works best. We have a lot of talk about, you know, is what Sweden is doing the right way, is what South Korea is doing the right way. I think at least having this luxury of comparison between different people and different communities, that's the right way. I wouldn't even try to pretend that any committee would be even close to being able to establish the necessary needs for the different communities. I don't think that's what government could be able to do. And I think this is Martin just asking me about beer, but yeah, hi Martin.
Okay. So I think we are done with questions, it seems. So thank you very much for your time and for the talk. And the talk will stay on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it if you want, or you can send it out. The YouTube channel is Students for Liberty CZ. We will also post it on Facebook. So if you want to see it, you will have the opportunity. And I believe that right now the British Conservation Alliance starts a new webinar with the Property and Environment Research Center from the US. So that might also be interesting to watch. So if you want to continue on your streak of libertarian events, this might be the place to go. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.